The station smelled like something between rust and rain. That was the first thing Danny Cole noticed when he stepped off the transport and onto the docking floor of Velarath Prime. It was not a bad smell. It was just strange. Everything about this place was strange. Velarath Prime was not a planet. It was a station, enormous, spinning slowly in the dark between three star systems, owned by no single species and claimed by all of them. Ships docked here from every corner of the known galaxy. Traders, diplomats, scientists, soldiers, and creatures that did not fit neatly into any of those categories. They all came here to talk, to deal, and sometimes just to stare at each other from a safe distance. Danny was 26 years old. He had been a U.S. Marine for 4 years. He had done 2 tours on Earth's outer colony stations and 1 difficult rotation on the moon base near Titan. He was not the kind of man who got nervous easily, but standing in that docking bay, watching a creature the size of a small car slide past him on 6 legs without even glancing his way, he felt something small and quiet move in his chest. Not fear, just the reminder that he was very far from home. He adjusted the strap of his bag and kept walking. The Earth Diplomatic Security Detail had 12 Marines on this assignment. Their job was simple on paper: protect the human delegation during the Velarath Accord Summit and do nothing that could cause a political problem. The Lieutenant Commander Grace Nolan had made that last part very clear during the briefing back on Earth. She was a tall woman with short brown hair and the kind of calm voice that did not need to be raised to be heard. She had done 3 prior rotations on alien stations, and she knew the rules better than anyone. "You are not here to fight," she had told them, standing at the front of the briefing room with her hands folded behind her back. "You are here to stand, watch, and if something goes wrong, to place yourself between the delegation and the problem. You do not start problems. You do not respond to words. You do not respond to gestures. You smile, you stay quiet, and you let the diplomats do their work." She had paused after that, looking at each of them slowly. "Some of the species here will test you. They will say things. They might do things. They have done it before. Your job is to let it go." Danny had nodded along with everyone else. That he understood the mission. He believed in the mission. The summit was important. Humanity had only been a formal member of the Galactic Accord for 11 years, and every diplomat on Earth kept reminding everyone that those 11 years were fragile. One bad moment could cost everything. So Danny understood restraint. He just did not enjoy practicing it. The human delegation's quarters were on level 7 of the station's diplomatic ring. It was a narrow corridor with pale walls and soft yellow lights that someone had clearly chosen to make human visitors feel more comfortable. It almost worked. Ambassador Laura Sims had her office at the far end, and her staff of 12 moved in and out of it all day like a small current. She was a sharp woman in her 50s with silver hair and a reputation for never losing her composure in a meeting. Danny had seen her once before, briefly, at a ceremony back on Earth. She had looked at him the way most senior diplomats looked at Marines, like useful furniture. That was fine. He was not here to be liked. His post for the first week was the entrance to the diplomatic ring on the main concourse level. It was a busy spot. Dozens of species passed through that corridor every hour. Some of them ignored him completely. Some of them stared. A few made sounds he could not translate and probably did not want to. He stood straight, kept his eyes moving. Aran said nothing. On the second day, he saw his first Dravith. There were 3 of them, walking together in a loose group near the center of the concourse. They were tall, nearly 8 feet, with scaled gray skin and long necks that turned slowly when they moved, like something that had never needed to hurry because nothing had ever threatened it. They wore dark clothing trimmed in deep red, and the other species on the concourse gave them space without being asked. Danny watched them from his post. They walked like they owned the floor under their feet. Not aggressive, exactly. just completely sure of themselves in a way that did not leave room for anything else. One of them looked at Danny as they passed. The look lasted only a second. It was not curious. It was the kind of look someone gives a piece of furniture they are deciding whether to move or walk around. They walked around him. That evening, Grace Nolan gathered the detail for a short briefing in their common room. She talked about the Draveth specifically because 2 other species' security teams had already flagged them as a potential friction point. The Draveth have a caste system, she explained, sitting on the edge of a table with a data pad in her hand. Everyone has a rank, and your rank determines how you are treated and how you treat others. To them, humanity is at the bottom. We are a young species. We have been in the Accord for 11 years. Some of their elder members have been part of it for 400. She scrolled through something on the pad. In the past 3 summits, Draveth members have made physical contact with human personnel on 7 recorded occasions. Shoulder shoves in corridors, deliberate blocks, one incident where a Draveth dignitary knocked a human delegate's documents off a table and kept walking. She looked up. Every time, the human response was to let it go. Every time the Draveth did it again at the next summit. The room was quiet. I am not telling you this so you get angry, she said. I am telling you so you are not surprised. They will test you. They may touch you. If they do, you step back. You look forward, and you report it to me. You do not respond. Am I clear? Everyone said yes. Danny said yes, too. He meant it. But that night, lying in his bunk and staring at the ceiling, when he thought about what it meant to be touched, to be shoved or struck, and to do nothing. He had spent 4 years training his body to respond. Every reflex, every instinct had been sharpened into one purpose. If someone puts their hands on you, you deal with it. Fast, clean, without hesitation. Turning that off was not like flipping a switch. He told himself it was fine. The mission was clear. He could handle it. He closed his eyes and listened to the quiet hum of the station around him. So enormous and old and full of species that had already decided what humans were before any of them had said a single word. Outside the viewport above his bunk, the stars sat still and cold against the dark, and Velarath Prime kept turning, slow and steady, the way it had for 1,000 years before humanity ever looked up and noticed it was there. The 4th day on Velarath Prime started like the first 3. Danny Cole woke up at 5 in the morning. Then even though there was no sunrise on a space station and his body had no real reason to know what time it was. Marines woke up at 5. That was simply what they did. He ate breakfast with 2 other members of the detail. A quiet man named Pete Garza, who had been in the Corps for 6 years, and a younger Marine named Calvin Webb, who had arrived on his first off-world assignment and was still trying to hide the fact that everything amazed him. Calvin kept looking out every viewport they passed, and Pete kept pretending not to notice. Danny liked both of them. He did not say so because that was not really something you said, but he liked them. By 7, he was at his post. The main concourse of Velarath Prime was different in the mornings. The big commercial traffic did not start until later, so the corridor was quieter, and the species that used it in the early hours tended to be the working kind. Technical staff, maintenance crews, junior diplomats running documents between offices. Danny had learned to recognize a few of them by sight over the past few days. There was a small green creature with 4 arms that always moved fast and always carried something. There was a pair of tall, thin beings with pale skin that came through at exactly the same time every morning and never looked at anyone. There was a Meshon delegate, stocky, blue-gray, with wide, dark eyes, who sometimes slowed when she passed Danny's post and looked at him with what seemed like genuine curiosity before moving on. Danny stood straight. He watched the corridor. He thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill he had developed over years of standing guard. At 9:17, the Draveth came. He heard them before he saw them, not because they were loud, but because the corridor changed when they arrived. The small conversations nearby dropped away, and the foot traffic thinned, not quickly, but the way water moves away from something heavy placed in it. Creatures that had been walking in one direction found reasons to go another way. Space opened up. There were 5 of them this time. 4 wore the dark uniform of Draveth personal guards, broad, scaled, and still as stone. The 5th walked in the center of the group, and he was the one that caught Danny's attention. His name, Danny would learn later, was Vorak Sel. That he was a senior Draveth dignitary, one of the highest-ranking members of the Draveth delegation at the summit. He wore deep red robes with black trim, and gold markings ran along the sides of his neck in a pattern that, among the Draveth, communicated rank the way a chest full of medals did for a human soldier. He was old, by alien standards. He had been attending Accord Summit since before Danny was born. He had interacted with human delegations at 4 of those summits, and in each one, he had done exactly as he pleased. He walked with the slow, deliberate ease of someone who had never once been made to hurry by anyone. Danny saw him coming and did what he had been trained to do. He stood still. He looked forward. He kept his face clear and his hands relaxed at his sides. The group was going to pass him. That was fine. He had watched dozens of species pass him in 4 days, and none of it had been a problem. Vorak Sel slowed. It was not a dramatic stop. It was just a small reduction in pace, the kind a person makes when something catches their eye. He turned his long neck and looked at Danny the way he had looked at him the first time in the concourse. That flat, assessing look that did not hold any curiosity, just measurement. Danny held his ground. He kept his eyes forward. He did not speak. Vorak Sel said something. Danny did not have a translation device active, but it did not matter. The tone was enough, low, almost amused. But the sound of a man saying something to a wall because he found it entertaining to talk to things that could not answer. One of the nearby alien bystanders, a small feathered creature near a vendor stall, went very still. The Meishan delegate who had been crossing the far side of the concourse stopped walking. People were watching. That was when Danny understood what this was. It was not an accident. It was not a moment of casual contempt. This was a performance. Vorak Sel had chosen this spot, this audience, this moment. He was going to demonstrate something in front of as many witnesses as possible, because the lesson was not really for Danny. It was for everyone else watching. Vorak Sel raised his hand. It moved slowly. There was no urgency in it, no anger. It was the motion of a being who did not expect any resistance, because in his experience, there never was. The hand came across and struck Danny Cole on the side of the face. It was not a powerful blow, and Danny had taken harder hits in sparring. The force of it barely moved his head. But that was not the point, and everyone in that corridor knew it. The point was the gesture. The point was the audience. The point was the long, calm pause afterward, in which Vorak Sel stood with mild satisfaction, waiting for the human soldier to do what human soldiers always did. Look away, step back, absorb it in silence. 1 second passed. Danny's head came back to center. His eyes, which had been forward and blank, were now focused. There was no anger in them, no heat. Just a shift, the way a light changes when someone flips a switch. Something that had been standing down stood up. 2 seconds. His body moved. It was not a lunge or a swing or anything that could be called emotional. It was a sequence, a tight, short, devastatingly efficient series of movements that his body had performed so many times in training that it did not need his mind to direct it. A grab. A redirect. A controlled application of force at exactly the right angle. 3 seconds. Vorak Sel hit the floor. The sound of it carried. The 4 Draveth guards did not move. Not because they were slow, but because by the time any of them processed what had happened, it was already finished. There was nothing to respond to. The threat was over. Danny stepped back to his post. He placed his hands at his sides. He looked forward. The corridor was completely silent. Vorak's cell lay still, and he was breathing. Danny had made sure of that, because he was trained to apply force, not to kill. But the senior Draveth dignitary, who had walked into this corridor expecting to deliver a lesson, was on the floor in front of witnesses from a dozen species, and he was not getting up quickly. The feathered creature near the vendor stall had not moved. The Mashon delegate on the far side of the concourse was staring. The 4 Draveth guards stood frozen. They're looking at their fallen superior, and then at Danny, and then at their superior again, running calculations that their entire history with humanity had not prepared them for. Danny Cole said nothing. He did not look down at Vorak's cell. He did not look at the guards or the bystanders or the recording devices that were already capturing everything from 3 different angles. He looked forward. He stood straight. He breathed normally. He was at his post. He was doing his job. And somewhere in the deepest part of his training, in the part that did not think or feel or calculate, only responded, something had simply been completed. A thing had happened. He had handled it. That was all. The station kept humming around him, old and vast, and now in some way it had not been 30 seconds ago, permanently changed. Grace Nolan heard about it before she saw it. She was in the middle of a routine coordination meeting with 2 other security chiefs, one Mashon and one from a species called the Veth, when her communication device buzzed twice. She glanced at it. The message was from Pete Garza. It said only 4 words: Concourse, Cole, come now. She excused herself without explaining why, which was something she was very good at, and walked fast toward the main concourse. By the time she arrived, Vorak's cell was back on his feet, but barely. 2 of his guards were supporting him. The other 2 had moved to stand in front of him, facing outward, and their posture the kind that meant they were one bad decision away from making things significantly worse. A small crowd had gathered at the edges of the corridor, beings of various shapes and sizes standing at a careful distance, watching with the focused attention of creatures who understood they were seeing something important. Danny Cole was still at his post. Grace looked at him for a moment. He was standing straight, his face calm, his eyes moving steadily across the corridor the way they were supposed to. There was a faint red mark on the left side of his face. That was the only sign that anything had happened. She walked to him slowly and stood beside him. She did not say anything right away. She looked at the Draveth guards. They looked back. Nobody moved. "Report," she said quietly. Danny kept his eyes forward. "The dignitary made physical contact with my face, ma'am." I responded. "He went down. He is breathing." I returned to my post. Grace was quiet for a moment. "Any use of a weapon?" "No, ma'am." "Any further contact after he went down?" "No, ma'am." She nodded slowly. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, not just the immediate situation, but everything that came after it. She had spent 5 years managing exactly this kind of pressure, and she knew that the next few hours would either contain this or turn it into something much larger. She turned to Pete Garza, and who had appeared beside her at some point. "Get Cole off the post. Take him back to quarters. Keep him there. I will handle this." Pete nodded and moved. Grace turned to face the Draveth guards. She stood straight and looked at the one in front without blinking. She did not speak. She simply made it clear, through every line of her body, that she was not leaving and she was not afraid. After a long moment, the guards stepped back. They gathered around Vorak's cell and moved him down the corridor. Ness and Grace watched every step until they were out of sight. Then she pulled out her communication device and called Ambassador Laura Sims. Laura Sims had been in meetings all morning. She was in the middle of a quiet discussion with two members of her staff when her senior aide knocked on the door and said it was urgent. She stepped out, took the device, and listened to Grace Nolan's account without interrupting. When Grace finished, Laura was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "So send me everything, every recording, every witness name you can get. I need it all before the Draveth file anything formal." She went back into the room and told her staff to clear the afternoon schedule. The Draveth filed formally within 2 hours. The grievance document was long and carefully worded. It described Vorak Sel as a senior dignitary of the Draveth Accord delegation, a representative of one of the oldest and most respected civilizations in the known galaxy. It described what Danny Cole had done as an unprovoked violent assault on a protected diplomatic figure. It used the word barbaric twice and the phrase species-level aggression once. It requested the immediate arrest of Corporal Cole, his removal from the station, and a formal apology from the human delegation to the Draveth people. The document was submitted to the Galactic Accord's Administrative Council, and copies were sent to the senior representatives of every species present at the summit. Ambassador Sims read it at her desk with her reading glasses on and a cup of cold coffee beside her. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the recording from the concourse which Grace had sent her within 20 minutes of the incident. She watched it 3 times. The recording was clear. The angle was good. You could see everything. Vorak Sel's approach, his pause, and the way he looked at Danny with that flat dismissal, the slow and deliberate motion of his hand before it struck. You could see Danny's head move from the impact. You could see the 1-second pause. And then you could see what happened after, clean and fast and final. Laura Sims was not a soldier. She had never been in a fight in her life, and she would not have lasted 3 seconds against a Marine in close quarters. But she had been in enough difficult rooms with enough difficult people to understand leverage when she saw it. She called in her senior legal advisor, a man named Carl Owens who had spent 8 years studying Accord law before this assignment. She showed him the recording. She showed him the Draveth grievance. Then she asked him one question. Does Accord law recognize the right to self-defense against physical assault? Carl pushed his glasses up and looked at his data pad. Article 14. At Section 3, he said, any member species personnel who is subjected to unprovoked physical contact by a member of another species retains the lawful right to defend themselves using proportionate force. Laura pointed at the recording. Was that proportionate? Carl watched the relevant section. The dignitary is still alive and able to walk, he said carefully. No weapon was used. The response ended immediately once the threat was neutralized. He paused. I would argue yes. Laura nodded. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. Then we are not apologizing. The room went quiet. Her staff looked at each other. This was not how it usually went. Grace Nolan, who was sitting against the far wall, felt something shift in the room. In her years of working with diplomatic teams, she had heard a lot of careful language and measured responses and strategic retreats dressed up as something else. What she had just heard was none of those things. It was a decision, a surreal one. News of the Draveth grievance spread through the station quickly. Diplomatic staff talked. Junior aides talked. The communication channels of a dozen species lit up with fragments of the recording, short descriptions, quick translations. By mid-afternoon, the footage was everywhere. You could not stop something like that from spreading on a station like this. Too many people, too many networks, too many beings who had been watching the public areas with their own recording devices. And the reactions were not what the Draveth had expected. In the private communication channel of the Tulhari delegation, a species that had been dealing with Draveth contempt for longer than most, a senior aide sent a one-line message to his ambassador. The humans are not going to apologize. The ambassador read it and said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked for the recording to be sent to his personal device. And the Meishan delegate who had been on the concourse that morning, the one who had stopped walking and watched everything happen in real time, sat in her quarters that evening and watched the footage 4 more times. She had interacted with humans twice before at prior summits. She had found them polite, a little anxious, and very eager to avoid trouble. She looked at the recording of Danny Cole returning to his post after the incident and thought about the gap between what she had expected and what she had seen. It was a very large gap. In the Accord's administrative offices, the council staff prepared for a formal hearing. The date was set for 2 days out. The Draveth legal team confirmed their attendance. The human delegation confirmed theirs. Grace Nolan sat alone in the security team's common room late that night, going through every piece of documentation she had gathered, making sure every second of footage was properly stored and time-stamped. She was tired. She had been managing crises all day, and she would be managing them again tomorrow. But underneath the tiredness, there was something else. Something quiet and solid that she had not felt during a diplomatic assignment before. She was not worried about the hearing. For the first time in 11 years of off-world service, she was genuinely not worried about what happened next when a human said no. That was a new feeling. She stayed with it for a moment, then went back to work. The hearing room in the Accord administrative wing was large and shaped like a half circle. The ceiling was high and the walls were pale, and the lighting came from strips along the upper edges that gave everything a clean, even glow with no shadows. And it was a room designed to be neutral. No species had more favorable positioning than any other, and the seats were arranged so that every delegation could see every other delegation clearly. When Danny Cole walked in, he noticed that every seat was filled. He had expected the delegations directly involved, the Draveth and the humans. He had not expected the rest of them. The Tolhari delegation sat in their section, their deep blue robes making them easy to spot. But the Meishan group was there too, the delegate from the concourse among them, sitting still and watching the entrance. Species Danny did not know the names of filled the other sections. Small ones, large ones, old ones. Some of them turned to look at him when he entered. Others were already watching. He walked to the human section and took his seat beside Grace Nolan. Ambassador Laura Sims was at the front of their group, sitting straight. With her hands folded on the table and a single data pad in front of her. She did not turn when Danny sat down. She kept her eyes on the front of the room. The Draveth delegation was to the left, across the curved space of the chamber. Vorak Sel was not present. He had been replaced by the Draveth legal representative, a tall, younger Draveth named Keth Ra, who wore the formal robes of the Draveth legal caste and carried a data stack thick enough to suggest he intended to be thorough. He sat with the calm confidence of someone who had won many rooms like this before. At the center of the chamber, behind a long curved bench, sat the Accord arbiters, 3 beings from 3 different species, chosen for their neutrality and age. The eldest of them, who would lead the session, was a being from a species called the Orath. No one in the room could agree on how old the Orath were as a civilization, but the general estimate was somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years of Accord membership. The elder arbiter was gray-white, slow-moving, and quiet, in the way that very old things tend to be quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have said most things before and know which words matter. The session opened with a reading of the formal grievance. Keth Ra presented the Draveth case carefully and without emotion. He described the incident in terms of Accord law, citing articles related to the protection of diplomatic personnel and the responsibilities of member species to maintain safe conditions for all delegates. He made no direct insults. He did not need to. The structure of his argument did that work on its own. A senior Draveth dignitary had been physically attacked by a human soldier in a public space. The law was clear. The penalty was clear. The only question, he suggested, Was whether the council would apply the law evenly or allow a younger species to behave in ways that a more established species would never be permitted. That last part landed carefully in the room. Danny watched a few of the other delegations shift slightly in their seats. Then Ambassador Sims stood up. She did not use many words. That was the first thing Danny noticed. She did not have a long, prepared speech. She had three things: the recording, a written account from Danny, and a second document that she placed on the shared display screen without announcing what it was. It took a moment for the room to understand what they were looking at. The document was a list. It was 11 pages long and covered 7 years of summits. It recorded every documented physical contact between Draveth members and human personnel during Accord events. The shoulder shoves, the deliberate obstructions, the incident where a human delegate's documents had been knocked to the floor. At the time a junior Draveth guard had grabbed a human aide by the arm and moved him aside like an object. 7 years, dozens of incidents, every one of them logged, time-stamped, witnessed, and after each entry, one word in the response column, none. The room was very quiet. Ambassador Sims let them read. She did not rush. She stood at the front of the human section with her hands at her sides and waited. Then she spoke. And she said that the human delegation did not deny what had happened in the concourse. Corporal Cole had struck Voraxel. She was not going to argue around that fact, but she asked the council to look at the full recording, not a portion of it. She asked them to look at it from the beginning, from the moment Voraxel entered the corridor and slowed down. She asked them to watch the way he looked at Danny, to watch the pace of his movement, to watch his hand rise. And she asked them to look at what came before and decide, with the full picture in front of them, which party had initiated the confrontation. Then she sat down. Keth Ra was on his feet immediately, with a counter-argument about the legal definition of assault and the threshold for self-defense under Article 14. He was composed and technically precise, and he cited 7 prior Accord rulings. He was very good at his job, but Danny could see that something had already changed in the room. So the elder Orath Arbiter had not moved during any of this. He sat with the stillness of something that had been sitting in this kind of room for a very long time. But when the counter-arguments finished and a short recess was called, he leaned slightly toward his 2 colleagues and spoke to them in a low voice that did not carry. Carl Owens leaned toward Grace Nolan during the recess and whispered that in 3 previous Accord rulings involving physical contact between species, the council had ruled against the species who made first contact in every case. Grace whispered back that she knew. They both looked at the Draveth table, where Keth Ra was reviewing his data stack with focused intensity. When the session resumed, the Elder Arbiter spoke for the first time. His voice was slow. Not weak. Slow. Like someone choosing each word individually and placing it down with care. He asked Keth Ra one question. Under Draveth law, if a lower caste Draveth member was struck in public by a higher caste member, would there be any expectation that the lower caste member would accept the contact without response? Keth Ra was quiet for a moment. Then he said that within Draveth society, caste hierarchy governed all such interactions. The Arbiter nodded. He asked his second question. Was Corporal Cole a member of Draveth society? The room was silent. Keth Ra opened his mouth, closed it, then said carefully that Corporal Cole was a member of the human species. The Arbiter nodded again. He said nothing more and looked down at his notes. Danny was called to speak near the end of the session. He stood at the front of the room and answered questions from all 3 arbiters. He kept his answers short. He described what happened the way it happened, in the order it happened. He did not add anything that had not been asked for. The Orath Arbiter asked him one question directly. After being struck, what went through his mind in the moment before he responded? Danny thought about it honestly. He said that nothing went through his mind, that his body had simply responded the way it had been trained to respond, and that his training was to stop a threat as quickly and efficiently as possible. The Arbiter looked at him for a moment. "You did not choose to respond," the Arbiter said slowly. "Your training chose for you." Danny looked at him. "My training is part of me, sir," he said. "When I chose to become a Marine, I accepted everything that came with it. The training is not separate from the choice." The Arbiter was quiet. Then he wrote something on his pad. Across the room, Danny heard it again, the sound he had heard briefly in the recording, described to him afterward by Pete Garza. The Tulhari delegate made a short sound, a laugh or something close to it, sharp and metallic. The delegate caught himself quickly and went still. But the sound had already moved through the room. The Draveth table did not react, but their stillness had a different quality to it than it had before the session started. The ruling came on the morning of the third day. It was delivered by the Elder Orath Arbiter in the same hearing room, with the same full attendance as before. If anything, there were more observers this time. The side sections that had been half empty during the hearing were full. And a few delegations had sent extra staff who stood quietly against the walls when the seats ran out. The ruling was not long. The Elder Arbiter read it in the same slow, deliberate voice he used for everything, as if the pace itself was a statement about the seriousness of each word. The Council found that the physical contact initiated by Vorak's cell constituted unprovoked assault under Article 14, Section 3 of the Galactic Accord Charter. The Council further found that Corporal Cole's response met the legal standard for self-defense, in that it was immediate, proportionate, and ceased the moment the threat was removed. The charges filed against Corporal Cole were dismissed in full. The Arbiter paused after reading that section. The pause was long enough that it became its own kind of statement. He then noted for the formal record that the compiled history of physical incidents involving Draveth members and human personnel, the 11-page document Ambassador Sims had entered into evidence, had been accepted and archived by the Accord Council. He said that the Council expected all delegations at future summits to be familiar with Article 14 and its provisions. He closed the datapad. He looked at the room. He said nothing more. The session ended. The Draveth delegation left quickly. Borkethra gathered his materials without looking at the human section, and the rest of the group moved behind him in a tight cluster. They did not speak to anyone on the way out. Vorak Sel, who had attended the reading in a seat behind the main Draveth table, was already at the door before the last word of the ruling finished echoing in the chamber. Danny watched him go. He did not feel satisfaction exactly. He felt something more neutral than that, the quiet sense of a thing being settled and set aside. Laura Sims turned to Grace Nolan and said, quietly and without any visible emotion, "Good." That was all. The rest of the room moved slowly. Delegations did not rush for the exit. They clustered in small groups, talking in low voices, and Danny noticed that several of those groups were looking at the human section as they talked. Not with hostility, with something more considered than that. And the Tulhari ambassador, a broad, dark-robed figure who had sat through the entire hearing without visibly reacting to anything, crossed the room toward Ambassador Sims. It was a small move and a deliberate one. He stopped in front of her, said something in Tulhari that the translation device rendered as a formal expression of acknowledgement, not quite a compliment, but close, and then moved on without waiting for a response. He did it the way someone does when they want to be seen doing it. And Ambassador Sims watched him go. She said to Carl Owens, who was beside her, "Make a note of that." Carl was already writing. Back at the human quarters, Danny Cole sat in the common room with Pete Garza and Calvin Webb. Someone had made coffee, the real kind from a sealed pack they had brought from Earth, and the three of them sat with cups in hand and said very little. Outside the viewport, a large transport ship was docking slowly, and its running lights blinking steady and slow against the black. Pete asked Danny if he had thought about what was going to happen after he threw the punch. Danny said no. Pete nodded, like that was the right answer. Calvin looked like he wanted to say something, changed his mind, and looked back out the viewport. Grace Nolan came in a little later. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from Danny. And she looked tired in the way people look after several days of carrying something heavy, not defeated, just emptied out and ready to be filled back up again. "Washington is happy," she said. Danny said that was good. She looked at him for a moment. "You know this is going to follow you for a while," she said. "Not in a bad way, but people are going to know your name." Danny wrapped both hands around his cup. "I was just at my post," he said. Grace almost smiled. "I know," she said. "That's the part they're going to talk about." In the days that followed, the summit continued. Diplomats met. Documents were signed. Agreements were made about trade routes and resource rights, and the protocols for joint scientific operations near the third ring of stars at the edge of mapped space. The machinery of galactic politics moved forward the way it always did, slowly, carefully, with a great deal of careful language and very little visible emotion. But something had shifted underneath all of it. The Draveth did not approach human personnel again. Not with a shove, not with a deliberate obstruction, not with any of the small, contemptuous gestures that had marked every prior summit. The corridor near the human quarters, where the Draveth had previously walked through without slowing, brushing past human staff as though they were part of the furniture, was now navigated with a wider berth. It was a small change. It was not advertised. But everyone noticed it. 3 smaller civilizations requested informal meetings with the human delegation. 2 of them had never sought direct contact with humans before. The meetings were brief, exploratory, and carefully polite. Ambassador Sims handled each one herself, and in her nightly reports back to Earth, she described each meeting in measured terms without drawing large conclusions. But Carl Owens, who compiled the records, "I noted privately that the number of unsolicited diplomatic contacts in the 5 days following the hearing was more than the human delegation had received in the previous 3 summits combined." The Mishan delegate stopped by the human concourse post on the second morning after the ruling. She stood in front of the Marine on duty, a young woman named Kelly Shaw, who was on her first off-world rotation, and looked at her for a moment. And then the delegate placed one hand flat against her own chest in a gesture that, in Mishan culture, was used between equals. She held it briefly and walked on. Kelly Shaw reported it to Grace Nolan that evening, not sure what to make of it. Grace thought about it for a while. Then she said it was a greeting, a real one. Not the kind you gave someone below you, not the kind you gave someone you were not sure about. The real kind. She told Kelly to return the gesture if it happened again. On the last evening before the human delegation's departure, Danny Cole stood at his post for the final time. The concourse was quieter at that hour, a gentle traffic of beings heading to their quarters or their ships, the pace of the station settling into something slower. He stood straight and watched the corridor and thought about nothing in particular, which he was good at. A small creature he had never seen before crossed the concourse at a slow waddle, heading toward the docking ring. It passed his post and looked up at him. It was short enough that looking up was the only option, and held his gaze for a moment with its wide, dark eyes. Then it made a short sound, almost a chirp, and kept walking. Danny watched it go. He did not know what the sound meant. He did not have a translation device running. It could have been anything, but it had looked at him before making it. That much was clear. It had stopped. They looked at a human Marine standing at a post on a station a very long way from Earth and made a sound directly to him before moving on. He decided to take that as something good. The next morning, the human delegation boarded their transport and left Velarath Prime behind. The station kept turning, slow and steady, as it had for 1,000 years. New ships docked. New delegations arrived. The business of the galaxy continued. But in the formal archive of the Galactic Accord, I filed under the summit's official record, was an 11-page document and a piece of security footage from a station concourse. Both would remain there for as long as the archive stood. Both would be read and watched by diplomats, scholars, and junior aides for years to come. Not because of the politics, not because of the legal ruling. Because of one human soldier, standing at his post, doing his job, and the 3 seconds that changed how an entire galaxy understood what that meant.